I want to do a video on an idea that came to me in a group meeting, a spiritual group meeting yesterday. I feel like I'm seeing everything through the lens of the metaphysics of quality these days. In the group, we were discussing a quote from John 7:8, where the adulteress is about to be stoned to death and Jesus intervenes. And the quote is, of course, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." I don't think I've really seen this as clearly as what I'm going to articulate, even though I imagine that this has been one of the major ethical, philosophical debates over the centuries. It's about morality, and the problem we were discussing is whether certain things like murder or slavery were always wrong or are only wrong now, or we only see them as wrong now. In other words, is morality fixed or fluid? Is there an eternal moral law, or is morality pragmatic and evolving? So related to the particular verse, the woman was about to be stoned for adultery. And today we find this absolutely barbaric. But what if at one time adultery was considered worse than stoning a person for it? Or were these ancient people just immoral? One side of the debate we were having was, in the past, the determination of paternity was critical to the stability of the community. It was critical for health reasons, for social reasons, and for economic reasons, at least. Therefore, adultery threatened the survival of the community and could not be tolerated. So the adulteress is a moral threat to the community, and they are about to stone her when Jesus intervenes and asks the crowd to consider if they are more moral than she is. So this is a turning point in the moral system, and that would mean that morality evolves and is therefore fluid. But it's really hard to wrap your mind around the fact that something like stoning someone for adultery is, in the right context, moral. It's a very hard thing to accept. The second conversation we had to do with the third way, which is a concept from theologian Cynthia Bourgeault. Here's the book, who wrote, this is the Law of Three, the Holy Trinity and the Law of Three. So the Law of Three would be that you have two fixed things, and when they react in a certain way. But with the third element, a dynamic element, something is created that's bigger and better than the combination of either of these two elements. So Jesus, like the greatest of brujos that he was, takes the crime, the one element, adultery, and the punishment, death by stoning, adds his insight to these two fixed things, and his insight being that the morality is no longer useful and is creating more problems than it's solving. So in this instance, you see individual morality emerging, collective morality receding. This is an example of the Law of Three. Here she describes it briefly.
My favorite analogy of how this works comes from sailing. Everybody will tell you that a sailboat goes through the water because of the opposition between the wind in its sails and the water, the gravitational frictional force of the water on its keel. And that's right, but it's not quite right. That's what I learned in 8th grade science, but I had to completely unlearn that when I got my first sailboat. Because a boat in that position doesn't go through the water. It rounds up into the wind and stops. And it's only when you add the third force, which is the helmsman holding the tiller, that the opposing forces come into a relationship that lets forward motion go. So you see what I mean here? And you may say, oh, well, that's obvious. But it's in the obviosities that we get so screwed up. It's obvious, but it's subtle. Because as long as you're thinking it's just these two things banging back and forth between each other and the boat's going to go through the water, you're going to sit there at the starting gate while the whole fleet goes beyond you. So there's always threeness. And if you look carefully, you can find it in anything. And very often, in fact, the law will say, is that when you find constant impasse, it's because the third is missing or blocked. And very frequently, it's already there in the situation, but you just don't see it.
Right. That means morality is both fixed and fluid, and that makes sense to me. So certainly no answers here, just some things to think about as these are things being addressed in the metaphysics, in Lila, by the metaphysics of quality. My interpretation so far of the metaphysics of quality is that it sees the world in terms of patterns rather than things, and that the true morality has a pattern versus thing perception of reality, and what makes it true morality? Well, the fact that it doesn't fall apart under scrutiny or with use, the fact that it's reliable. So what's a practical application in implementing a pattern over thing perception of the world? For one thing, perceiving the world in a pattern way allows you, for example, to see the two political movies on the same screen. That metaphor describes a pattern perception rather than an object perception. For example, you see both sides at once versus left good and right bad, or vice versa. So you don't get stuck in thinking you are right and good and your fellow citizens are wrong and evil. The good and evil isn't in these things. The good and evil is in the appropriate use of dynamic quality. Things that stay static for too long become evil. Things that are changed before they should be become evil. A more concrete example, in my work, I have to see past what people are telling me into their psychological patterns. And a side effect of this habit is that it's very difficult to be judgmental of people once you see the patterns. You see that they are not bad or evil, they're just stuck in a pattern. I credit psychodynamic training for this, and note the composite word containing dynamic. I also give credit to my interest in mysticism. Both these ways of seeing are pattern ways of seeing. So if we're to live a quality existence, we need to update our conscious experience of the world into perceiving patterns over things. So tomorrow I'm going to put out a video about Feeders's insight on a particular political issue that is at the forefront of the news. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.